thank you for coming. No, first thing is I need to understand how to use this thing. Okay. And of course, thanks to a whole community of people at Cornell, and these are the only ones I can mention here, who have helped me to work and think through the casts. These include my co-curator, Verity Platt, a lot of students, Dean Peter Lepage, who asked me to take care of the casts in 2008, and many others in the museum and beyond. I can't mention everybody, but this is to show you how much of a collaborative effort this is, right? And it really helped me to grow, to learn and unlearn, as you will hear. So what I want to do today is briefly to give you a little bit of an intro into the genealogy of this edited volume, and then an overview of how we have organized it, give you a quick intro for those who are not familiar with plaster casts, what they are, a short history of Cornell's cast collection. I know this sounds like a lot, but I try to be quick, and then pick out a few of the articles that have, illuminate certain problems, let's say, with the casts. I'm very grateful for Hannah, who's going to join us. And I think also on Zoom is my Berlin colleague, Lorenz Winkler-Horacek, who is also the co-editor of the volume. Lorenz, I hope you can hear me. Okay, let's start. The genealogy is that Lorenz and I were co-teaching together at the University of Rostock in Germany for many years, and had to deal with the Plaster Cast collection there, which was in ruins. This is the former German East. And so we immediately thought of the destruction of cast collections in a political sense. We had both learned classical archaeology. I should say this, we are both classical archaeologists, so teach Greek and Roman art and archaeology. And in Germany, these plaster cast collections of usually only Greek and Roman sculpture are an asset, like a default asset of any institute of classical archaeology, period, right? And so we are very used to these beautiful collections, but then, had to deal with their destruction. Thought this has to do with, the communist East and the capitalist West, maybe, things like this. And having this in mind, I come to Cornell, and Dean Peter Lepage asked me to take care of the Cornell cast collection. And what I see is this. You see it here on the right-hand side. And I thought, oh, maybe, it's not so easy to map this kind of destruction onto this kind of political context. And so we thought we really need to investigate these questions. We were very dissatisfied with the typical way the history of cast collections is being told. And this is a whole subfield of classical archaeology, plaster cast studies with their own conferences, publication volumes, etc. And the usual narrative is very linear from, rise and fall, right? And then eventually falling from grace and eventually revival, but that's it. And we thought that does not give justice to the complexity of plaster casts. And so we thought we wanted to understand the moment of destruction as a meaningful moment in the reception of both the classical world and of plaster casts. That's why we organized a first conference here at Cornell in 2010, and with people from Japan, Australia, and of course Europe. And for the first time, then we realized, Eurocentric as we had been, that of course we need to think much more globally. And also, we need to think in terms of, the colonialist heritage and tradition of these cast collections. This was completely out of our horizon, or had been completely out of our horizon at this point. So we thought, okay, we need a second conference, which we organized in Berlin in 2015, where this colonialist side was new to many and also met with some resistance, I have to say. And then, you realize this, it has taken us a long time to publish this volume, because we kind of started to learn and again unlearn. And I don't think we are completely done with the questions that came up. And so I'm very grateful, I should have mentioned this also in my first slide, to all the contributors to the volume who stood with us and remained loyal to the project, although it took us quite a while to finally come to grips with it. The way we have organized it, I realize it's not easy to see. We have all the themes are interconnected, but we wanted to start with this colonial and post-colonial context of plaster cast collections, which I still think is the most important field to be investigated. Then we looked at contested classification, art versus archaeology versus anthropology. We'll see that one of the issues and problems with casts is that they are so difficult to classify. Then contingencies of value, contingencies of authenticity, and then finally revolution and iconoclasm. And what I want to do here, I mean, first a little intro, but then I want to go back. I want to start with iconoclasm and then sort of, in a way, trace the way we thought and we our thinking proceeded, and then end with this the post-colonial contexts. So for those of you who are not familiar with the plaster cast, what is a plaster cast? A plaster cast is a one-to-one almost replica of a three-dimensional object in plaster. To that purpose, you take a mold from the surface of this your prototype. I give you an example here of a 19th century mold of the so-called Ludovisi that you see here on the left-hand side. This would be the original in marble in Rome. You make a mold. In the 19th century, the molds would be made of plaster too. Today, it's silica, etc. Make this mold, and then you often have to do it in pieces, right? Put the mold together and fill it with plaster, gypsum, dissolved in water. Fill the hole with this liquid plaster. Let it harden, and then if you take off the mold, you have the one-to-one replica in plaster. And this process can be repeated many times. I used to say once the mold is done, it's pretty easy, but even making the mold is already a very difficult endeavor. It's usually sculptors who do this. You have to think, you have to plan this kind of it's like a puzzle in 3D, but in the negative. And as you can see, especially in the 19th century, you cannot, a sculpture has a complex surface, so you have to really, in order to capture it in the full, you have to work with so-called piece molds that you then put together in a kind of shell, right? And then from there, you can produce the three-dimensional model. Plaster Cast Collections, as I said before, were important for teaching classical art, of course, especially in places where there was no art, original art, so to speak, available, like Cornell, for example. But there, apart from that, I think the reasons why they have become so important to us nowadays is that the casts conserve objects that sometimes do not exist any longer. I give you an example from the Cornell collection where the original was destroyed in World War II, but we have the cast. Sometimes the objects have changed over time due to, again, war or natural, the environment, etc. I give you an example again on the left, part from the Parthenon frieze in Cornell's collection, here photographed in our warehouse, and on the right-hand side, the way the original looks today, right? Before the cast, after the cast was taken, the head was chipped off, or the surface of the original was destroyed. So the casts keep a lot of information. They also help us eventually to retrieve looted objects. In this case, there was a suspicion that the Boston Museum had bought the piece on the right-hand side that belonged to a sculpture in Turkey, and by making casts and fitting those, it was before moving the originals, right? It was clear that they two belonged to each other. Finally, you can do experiments with the cast. The whole polychromy can be tried out on plaster casts. You wouldn't do this with the original. So these are not only instruments for teaching, but also for research and experiments, if you want. And then also, and that's something that I learned more and more actually while being at Cornell, they do not only trace the history of the original, but also eventually capture different, depending on when they were made, different stages in the biography of an object. So here these are plaster casts on the bottom of the pediment of the Temple of Athena, Athena Fire in Aegina. The originals are in Munich. And they were, when they were brought to Munich, were completed by the neoclassicist sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen and his team. This is 19th century, people wanted to see a complete pediment. In the 1970s, all these additions were taken off again, because people thought, first of all, they were wrong, and they also looked awful. But the Cornell casts, as you see below, capture this 19th century stage, right, of the collection. So they, interestingly, it shows us that these casts also have more than one meaning. they do not only stand in for their prototype, and this would have been the way I was educated, right? But being a classical archaeologist, they are almost synonymous with their prototype. This here made me think, okay, they also have a history, and they trace different layers of the prototype itself, or as we see, eventually have their own history, and that's what the Cornell, the history of the Cornell casts can teach us. I also want to say when we started that, and sort of a shout out to the library, when we started to do a database of all the fragments of the casts we had, the DCAPS team made me think really hard through all the different layers. I would always say, well, this is like the Parthenon frieze, 5th century, and they would say, no, this is a 19th century copy of, right, or a 19th century copy of a Roman copy of a Greek original. And why this was maddening, it made me really think through the fact that how complex and more interesting and multifaceted these casts are, right? So they speak to more people. The Cornell collection was founded in 1892, or opened in 1892, the so-called Sage collection by a donation, William Sage. I think that Henry Sage, the first archaeologist, Alfred Emerson, was the one who was mostly involved in choosing the cast. Emerson that's very emotional for me, had studied in Munich. And so I think he was aware of had learned with the plaster cast in Munich, and thought how useful, or knew how useful it is to have such a collection here. And so he brought hundreds of casts to Cornell, which were first exhibited in McGraw. That's what you see here. It's the first Museum of Classical Archaeology that moved at the beginning of the 20th century to Goldwin Smith Hall. When Goldwin Smith Hall was built, the whole basement was devoted to the Plaster Cast Collection. You can see more space, but also a little bit more bleak, I feel. The other earlier ones are a little more charming. Anyhow, but over time, when of course classics lost in importance and space was needed for other things, these rooms and places were repurposed. The north wing of the cast collection, north wing of Goldwin Smith, became, you see this on the upper left, the first Temple of Zeus Cafe, right? You see the cast still, Temple of Zeus casts still in place, but then a cafe. Whereas then when this room was turned into Kaufmann Auditorium on the bottom left, the Temple of Zeus Cafe moved to another room, and the casts, bottom right, moved up to what at this time was the Bienenkorb Advising Center, now Career Center. And then finally, in 2015 or 16, when Kleiman Hall received this atrium, some of the casts that we had conserved and restored went up for a new exhibition that Verity Platt curated. And the only thing that reminds us of the fact of the reason for the name of the Temple of Zeus Cafe is the little miniature models, right, of the pediments of this temple. What this history tells us again, it gives us again different layers of the casts. And to take the Temple of Zeus figures as an example, right, they stand in for an important monument of classical archaeology, also myth, Centauromachy, the Olympia as the site of the Olympic Games, so you can relate this to modern times. They stand in as plaster casts for an important moment in the history of cast collections and also in history of archaeology, because at this time, when they were excavated, 1875, the Greek state, this was a landmark treaty, stipulated that the excavating nation, Germany in this case, was not allowed to take the originals to Germany. They had to remain in Greece, but the Germans were allowed to have sort of the monopoly on making molds and making casts and sell those. So the Cornell casts come from Berlin. We found the order in the ledgers in Berlin. And then the next story is the Temple of Zeus story, right? This is very unique to Cornell. And that's usually the entry point for our students. It has nothing to do with Olympia or whatever. It's the cafe on campus. And we need to take this seriously too. Okay, so let me go a little bit through the different aspects of the destruction of casts. And I start with revolution and iconoclasm. I cannot talk about every article, of course, but one aspect of destruction, and that was one that, of course, shaped our perception too very much, is, of course, destruction and war. I give you two examples. And I show the slides I captured it from the book, because this is being recorded. I wanted to make sure that it's clear that these are from the book, and with all the references, etc. So, for example, here the Plaster Cast Museum in Nancy University, destroyed by the Germans in World War I, and then the Munich cast collection of the Fine Arts Academy after World War II. But then there were, of course, destructions, and I have to say destruction and iconoclasm happened throughout time, only for different reasons, and it wasn't always easy to really pinpoint them, and we'll see why, because the casts have such a different, or are so complex. But the most dramatic and sort of most iconic, if you want, moment of iconoclasm is usually what happened in, after World War II in art academies. The most famous one is, of course, the Paris École des Beaux-Arts in 1968, where the student revolution also started, or had this most sort of, again, iconic moment in destroying the very old cast collection of the École des Beaux-Arts. And similar things happened in Munich. There you have two examples on the right-hand side, where, for example, the one figure here on the lower right makes it clear that the destruction of the connection is a political act. It talks about the Braune Akademie, the Brown Academy, meaning brown like the uniforms of the Nazis. So here the 1968 reaction is against the old structures. Students had discovered that many of the professors had been Nazis, etc. Whereas for the French too, the connection is, the destruction is a symbolic act that meant, a reaction against petrified structures of education, the state, eventually, in very vague terms, any kind of imperialism, etc. But it was very difficult often for us to really pinpoint what really was the target. In this case, it's the only moment where we have some sort of documentation that gives us some sense of what was the program behind this. Otherwise, the reasons can be multiple, and often afterwards, in some of the more oral documentation, we feel that people regret that they destroyed the cast. So they are kind of bodies, and there is a reaction or relation to them. Other examples from Paris here, not from the École des Beaux-Arts, but in the universities, Bordeaux and Strasbourg. On the right-hand side, it's probably difficult to read, but the guy with the shield, again, one of the Egina figures has the letter CRS. I've forgotten, Laurent, you might know, it's like the French National Police, right? And SS, like the Sturmstaffel, like the Nazi organization. And on the left-hand side, some more funny, like graffiti in the Archaeological Institute in Paris, where the cast sort of act out lifting these figures act out lifting the cast or jumping from them or falling down. The next point, or the next area that we discussed, contested, there are other themes, but the one that I wanted to focus on, contested classification, art versus archaeology versus anthropology, is probably the key to why casts why it's so difficult to pinpoint the reason behind the destruction of casts, because they are so difficult to classify. On the one side, there's a long tradition that says that showed us that casts were considered more valuable than the originals, right? They were white, pure, not as dirty and messy as the originals, clear form, etc. On the other side, they could also be merely archaeological objects, right? Historical, if you want, scientific objects. So how does that square art versus archaeology? In anthropological collections, sometimes they interestingly sort of were subsumed in a broader narrative, comparatively, history of religions. And then the classical casts would eventually play a role there, which often saved them from destruction because they in a way became invisible and were not as prominent. On the other side, that's something we also haven't had the chance to completely explore, but I think this deserves further investigation. Casts were also, on the one side, really an instrument of democratization of art, if you want, right? The canonical figures were available everywhere. That was certainly a reason for Cornell to have these casts. On the other side, this also meant a certain commodification of the casts. You could have them also in different dimensions, as your home decoration if you want. And so this constant sort of oscillating between, art and scientific object, or scientific object and freak show. Casts would be decoration for, panopticons or some pageants, etc. Between, expensive and priceless document and then cheap plaster thing, right, really made them difficult to grasp. And I think this might also have been the reason here at Cornell why they were at a certain point discarded, because if they don't have, I mean, the moment to conserve them is there is a strong institutional framework that makes sense of them. And they made sense of it here at the beginning, right, with the archaeological context, but the moment that the discipline is no longer so important, or classics is no longer so important, then of course these things become weird. And Hannah will later talk more about it, where, you know, to the students at a certain point they appeared as monstrous or absurd, you know, and nobody could make sense of them anymore. What I show here is a scheme that our colleague Adam Rabinowitz from UT Austin, Texas at Austin, has developed, and that sort of, in a way, with the article with which I found peace with what happened to the Cornell collection. Here it shows the advantages of a cast collection that has lost its institutional framework. It was no longer, you know, the classical collection became interesting for other people on campus, especially the bodybuilders. And so they got their, and it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger has a whole encyclopedia, and they were interested in getting the cast to their institute of kinesthesia, et cetera, kinesthetics, et cetera, and had the, you know, as you see, students drawing from them, and they were really like models for sports students and bodybuilders. And whereas at the beginning, you know, coming from my classical archaeological Eurocentric background, I would have thought of this as a disgrace. Now I think it's wonderful, right? This is the moment to make it interesting. Adam also came up with an alternative to the linear story of, you know, success and rise and then fall. He thinks of it, and he's totally right, in a more spiral way. There's often the discovery and then discarding, rediscovery, etc. So, and then also, you know, in different, it's just more complicated, right? And I think his scheme, and I'm happy to talk more about it, gives you a good idea of this. I'm not going to talk about this a lot. This is Hannah Hume's article about the Cornell collection, so I skipped that, and Hannah can talk about her article. We realized, and that was sort of the aspect that we had completely left out of our conversations before, that in our initial excitement about the fact that cast collections are everywhere in the world, we had forgotten about the really politically like dark sides of it, namely casts, and especially plaster casts of Greek and Roman sculpture as instruments of colonialism, settler colonialism, right? Where these casts would be sent to, especially, you know, Australia, South Africa, etc., to either civilize the uncivilized, right, or confirm the exclusive, you know, like society of the settlers, right, who had their own museums and where the non-settlers, the natives, were not admitted to. And so we looked at different examples. One that was particularly interesting, in a way also less dire, or can I say terrible. Japan is a sort of semi-colonized context where the caste did not come, were not imposed by colonizing nations, but Japan in the modernizing moment of the late 19th century invited Italian sculptors and cast makers to bring and come to Japan, bring casts, and so that the students could learn naturalism. They were not supposed to sculpt from these casts, but they were supposed to draw them. And that you know, continued over again, and for a long time, even at a point when casts were no longer in favor in other institutions in Europe, or even in the United States. In Japan, they continued to draw these casts, which at the time, Shinya Araki, who went through this training, also said it created kind of love-hate relationship of students with these casts that then, if even not in the big art academies, you know, continued to be exposed and then taught in smaller art schools, which also led to the very funny and, again, conceptually very interesting how can I say, phenomenon that these plaster casts, of course, you know, sometimes they fall off or they get damaged, you need to make a new cast. There were no forms, so they had to make forms take forms from, or molds from the casts, which we call aftercasts. And so over the years, you have a cast of a cast of a cast of a cast. If you know about the casting process, it means that way that it uses in precision. The casts become a little more fluffy. They look a little bit deformed and transformed. So that also means that these figures look a little bit differently. And the other thing is that translation helped to also transform these figures in weird ways. the terms, so what these figures represented, where the example on the left-hand side, for example, would be a backhand, if I pronounce this correctly, in English. And this then had to be translated into Japanese, transcribed, and then was retranscribed from Japanese into English. And so the backhand became pageant, this figure here. So in event then also what these figures were described to be had nothing to do with what they actually represented. So, but it's a wonderful way of transforming them. And then, the one reaction of the artists at the time would be to sort of playfully produce them in miniature. You see this in the center. You could actually get them in kind of surprise eggs. And I've brought two of them with me. You can look at them later. For $2, you could get them in some thing, or they have become the stars of an anime show. These are casts that are, they are totally misbehaving. I have to, appear in shows and don't know how to behave correctly. Anyway, the so-called Sekko boys. So this is a way of embracing the copying and also the fetishism and the commodity aspect of the cast, but really turn it. I find it's a kind of iconoclasm from within, in a very interesting way. The more, the more dark side came through to us actually in a presentation by Henrik Holm, at the time curator of the Royal Cast Collection in Copenhagen, who really showed us how important it is to not dislodge the cast collection from the places in which they are displayed. And in Copenhagen, the Royal Cast Collection, which I always loved and thought it a great location, the location is a warehouse for trade with the former Danish West Indies. So an area where also slaves came to Copenhagen. And Henrik had the great idea to invite artists to thematize exactly that aspect. And you see two examples here. Victoria Mingo, half Caribbean artist, in a way shocked by the fact to realize that her ancestors, had gone through this house, created this kind of jewelry that was meant to, also remember the cane sugar trade, etc., and combined this with the plaster cast. And the same, or it's in a similar way, Janet Ehlers in a very, I only have a photograph, but you can look it up on YouTube, a very powerful performance that she staged at several places, but also in the cast collection. She herself, of half Caribbean descent, whips a white canvas with this whip that is in charcoal, like ripped in charcoal, and then whips it in front of these casts, and that makes these casts also speak differently. Also in an interesting way, there are scenes of suffering also in classical casts, and you see them differently when you get this kind of context. So that made me also think more, and this is my contribution to the volume, more rigorously about what does it mean to do research with cast collections. We always thought this is sort of the most positive aspect and the most innocent aspect of cast collections, to think of them in terms of research instruments. And then it was Maori scholar Linda Tui-Weiss-Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, that made me understand how fraught even the term research can be, especially from the point of view of the colonized, for whom this was always a moment of murder, betrayal, right, exploitation, etc. And so that's why I started to look closer at the way research with cast collections was done, especially in the 18th and 19th century. And there you realize how the casts were used to again prove the racial superiority of the white European body. Often I would not think of the casts as, we would always say, well, they are white because it's abstract. And it's just the form, right? You see the form better in the white plaster cast. Here, this made me understand how the abstraction is exactly this universalist manner, right? This makes these classical figures appear as man as such. So I give you the famous Apollo Belvedere, who, by the phrenologist Franz Josef Gall, was used to prove the superiority of the Europeans because of their skull, right? So he, in a way, shaved the cast. Of course, you cannot do that, but represented the head without hair. The same thing with the beauty of the Europeans. In this case, it's the skull scholar Blumenbach in Göttingen, who had this wonderful, beautiful skull of a woman from Georgia, the Caucasian race. And in order to make people understand how beautiful this one must have been, he, recurred to a cast of this so-called clitia that you see here in this picture. In all these, schemes, you see that they go from the ape or monkey to here on the bottom right to the Apollo, right? Apollo, the sculpted artwork is put on the same level as living beings, to a point that we realize that in art academies, the ideal and the real really merged. These are two examples from the association in Amsterdam, the Felix Meritis Society, where a doctor, Andreas Bonn, gives a lecture to artists about human anatomy, and you see that's the picture on the left-hand side. The model is a living model, but imitates the pose of the Apollo Belvedere, so the statue, which you could see next door, right, picture on the right-hand side, in the cast collection. So things were so merged and next to each other that, what seemed to me is a total bogus thing, right? And it's clear that these were not even the artists at the time would say these are, artistic, not real proportions, but the constantly being exposed to this really fostered the idea that these idealized bodies are real bodies. And that's sort of the dark side. Before I said that's the democratizing aspect of the plaster cast, is that they are available to everybody or easily. That's the dark side, that what Cornell professor James Cutting calls the mere exposure, being exposed to the same things over and over and over again without being really always aware of where they come from, what they mean. These petrify and sort of reify certain ideas about the human body, and I think this is a problem that we still haven't really grappled with. So, question would be, what is the future of cast collections in view of this problematic heritage? I give you two examples. I honestly don't know what we can do, but one is sort of art and fashion show, and this is an example from Berlin on the left-hand side, with a combination of sustainable fashion, and the plaster cast, and the one that I like more on the right-hand side, again, Copenhagen. There, Henrik Holm had an artist destroy a cast. They smashed it, and the remnants were put together and then dissolved in water, and from the new, plaster gypsum, the artist made this cylindrical roll here on the floor. So that has nothing to do with the classical form. So that has nothing to do with the classical sculpture anymore. Here at Cornell, and I want to end with this, we tried to do this with two exhibitions many years ago, where on the one side we thematized the manipulated, painted over cast and the destruction, and thinking about the political message behind this. And then on the other side, at the Johnson Museum, this was at Beebe Lake, at the chilled water plant, and on the right-hand side, an exhibition at the Johnson Museum, where we really talked about the artistic canon and what the cast contributed to establishing a canon, namely the kind of reproduction over and over again. That again, the canon has nothing to do, or very little to do, with the eventual, quality of works of art. It's just the fact that they are being reproduced over and over again. So that's the power of the cast, in a good and in a very bad sense. Thank you. And now I think Hannah should eventually give her little spiel on the Cornell collection. Do you want to?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Hannah Hume. I was a contributor to this really wonderful, part one of this really wonderful series of articles about casts. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you all, Annette. I appreciate it. So I conducted research first as an undergraduate student in 2013, 2014, largely focused on a more anthropological view of how the Cornell cast collection was viewed. At the time, as Annetta noted, we were going through a bit of a phase at Cornell of trying to find, identify, document, and exhibit these casts once again. And so you can see here on this slide a frieze that is, I believe it's still up in a staircase in Goldwyn Smith Hall. Yes. And someone at some point, most likely in the past 30, 20 years, wrote, "What killed your creativity and made you?" And we can't see the rest. unfortunately. And then, of course, here on the right is what now is a relatively famous photograph of the I'm Art on the bull metopee from Olympia. And so my research, again, like I said, focused not necessarily on classifying or really delving into the casts themselves, but more onto how they were displayed and how students interacted with them from the past, present, and future. So I was very glad to have the access to the fantastic Cornell library system because a lot of the works of previous journal entries, previous letters of students, the registers, the lists of classes and things like that were digitized and available at the time, even in 2013, which seems like quite a long time ago. So was able to look at letters home, like I mentioned, from students at the time who were talking about visiting McGraw Hall and seeing armadillos and I think it was like a bust of an elephant and the casts. And then later on, exploring the Museum of Casts at Goldensmith Hall. So it was a very interesting history to peruse. In 2013, I conducted some surveys and some interviews as well for it was about 45 students at the time to see what their perspective was and perception was on the cast that they were seeing daily, but perhaps not even noticing, and came up with some somewhat surprising results that most people, regardless of whether they thought these were art objects, felt that they were very valuable and very important to Cornell. So that's really where my my research ended. And then, of course, through this beautiful publication, was able to revisit some of that material while I was a master's student in history and archaeology. But I'm happy to say, Annetta, wouldn't you agree that now the casts at Cornell have a much more prominent role and a bit more exhibition and a bit more opportunity for folks to actually view them? So grateful for that. But was there any questions specifically, Annetta, you wanted me to touch on, or should I just wait for Q&A?
We can open it up to the audience. Thank you, Hannah. That's great.
Of course.
Thank you so much, and Hannah too. Thank you. I have two questions, one for each. Annetta, you talked about the moment when the intellectual infrastructure around these statues disappeared or disintegrated or lessened anyway, or around the casts. So I'd love to know a little more about the time scale of that. Like when do you see the critical shift in the arts college, say, when maybe classical archaeology was considered less a kind of central part of the curriculum? When exactly does that happen? And Hannah, I'd love to hear more about why the students valued the casts. You know, the students you spoke to relatively recently, you know, what was their impression of the importance of these for the institution? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. That's a wonderful occasion to be a little bit more specific. And what we also learned again is that these moments can be, whereas we have a general sense that, you know, the best moment for the plaster cast was the late 19th century, and the fall from grace is sort of, let's say, the 1960s. In looking at these histories, you know, more specifically, then they can be very different. At Cornell, I would think that the casts for the art school were different, or had a different story than those for classical archaeology. Those for classical archaeology came in the late 19th century. That's the high point, and certainly used to be still part of the museum. But I think with Alfred Emerson leaving pretty early in the late 19th century, he went to Chicago and then Berkeley. So he actually figures at several moments in the book. Cornell wasn't so much of a, you know, classical archaeology. I mean, his successor taught this in a more traditional way, I would think. And I think this was already the end pretty early of the cast collections, that it didn't make sense anymore, or it only made sense in more artistic terms, whereas what Emerson had wanted this to be a very scholarly collection with inscriptions and mundane things, like not the big artworks. these are lost now, right? Because they probably were totally meaningless, right? And so in other places, this happened at different moments in time. And I think that's, again, it was important for us to realize how we need to also differentiate by, honestly, even within Europe, nations. Again, Germany would constantly, because the casts play such an important role in reconstructing ancient sculpture, etc. They would, no matter the state of destruction, they would start try to reconstruct everything and sort of make this moment disappear in the history of the collections. Whereas the French, as cliche as it sounds, totally political, and you keep the smash casts and they were documented, and the painted over casts, right? So yeah, it leads us to, against this sort of broader background, into more specific histories. One could also say that the end of starts already in the late 19th century, where it's just too much of these plaster casts all over, and that's the moment where people felt a certain nausea. Interestingly, again, that's a thread that comes through. Often people were shocked at the casts, in a museum, like not originals. And it's often the art historians as opposed to the archaeologists who are used to more, less valuable objects maybe. But they would say, famously, a critic in Berlin said, well, somebody, in a truly Caesarean manner should throw them into the river Spree altogether, or give them to the departments of art history and archaeology. There they do the least harm, right? So there you see also the different disciplinary, in a way, context. Anyway, Hannah.
No, I agree completely. And it's interesting, your dating as well is something that I also saw reflected in those historic notes and historic letters. It does seem to be around the 1920s is when the cast collections no longer written about in the registers. And by the 1930s, they're being talked about as reproductions, and students are saying that visiting them is like going to a morgue. And so it really is perhaps earlier than maybe you would anticipate, that they are falling out of favor after that 1904 fluorescence, right, in Goldwyn Smith Hall, when they have the huge exhibition space. To talk to the point about why were they seen as valuable, I think is a very interesting question. And like Annetta mentioned, the fact that they were preserved though broken is, I think, a lot to do with it. So I was speaking to one student who, and I can read a little bit of her interview answer, but she said that she felt they were valuable because they were broken and yet they were kept on site. And so that proved that they were something that needed to be taken care of and had a history and had a story that should be told. I think the other aspect of it is because they're within this overall context of a neoclassical building, they're seen as part of that space for a lot of students. And so most students, not all, of course, respect for the place that they go to school. And so I think part of it is that they believe that it is part of this history of the institution. So that's valuable to them as someone who is excited to be in college, for instance. And then thirdly, when I was speaking to many people, especially those who felt that they were a little odd or uncanny, the idea that these faces were staring at them that had this presence, this really strong aura, if you will, within the environments that they were being seen, gave them a gravity that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. I don't think if it was small plaster casts of dogs, for instance, you might have the same reaction, but that these are large scale people looking at you seem to have a lot to do with that value that was assumed.
If I can add, this wonderful, the casts as bodies, right? Again, that the idea that these are ghosts or dead bodies is something we already find in the Romantic era. People, this is an up and down. But on the other side, what happened to the Cornell cast showed me that they were real bodies. I mean, Kasia Maroney, I don't know, Kasia, if you're there, and I hope you can tell the story. I've written it in the book anyway. They were assaulted, the plaster casts. The most famous example is one of the Venus figures that we restored or had cleaned for the exhibition at the Johnson Museum. It was in Sibley Hall, and had all, the vagina sort of scribblings with pencil, etc.
Master cast, right?
Yeah, and then we had Kaja clean it because there were all these drippings, and she said, "Why, yeah, glue," but it was also urine and semen, and that was of course fantastic because there are all these stories about agamatophilia, so sexual statues in antiquity, and it made total sense to me that these plaster casts were bodies. Or another famous example that happened when I was here. A huge reclining Ariadne figure was in Sibley Hall at the time. I mean, tons, it weighs. And one day it was gone. Henry Kranz told me, well, some frat boys took it. Well, and I was immediately, make them pay. And he said, no, this is like spring break amnesty. But it was found, I mean, this huge, colossal sculpture, apparently by staff on the bar of the frat house with beer bottles. And I'm pretty sure they had sat on this body of this woman, reclining, one breast exposed, and had sort of scratched things in her arms, etc. I mean, as terrible as it is, right? On the other side, it shows that these things, even if it's plaster, they are bodies. There's a different reaction to them, and that goes against this idea, right, that these were just like cheap replicas. In individual contexts, people made sense of them, and if you go through our colleagues' offices, some of them have real, I feel, personal relationships with their casts. They don't want to give them up. Yeah.
It's from Robin Whitehouse.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting to hear a perspective of this from the United States. I'm interested, as I'm conducting a research about the disposed cast collection of the Royal Academy of Art, The Hague in the Netherlands. Does a smashed cast collection still belong to the Academy that used to own them, considering the Academy accepted the fact that they were being smashed in the 1960s? Does the Academy still own the smashed fragments?
Quite the question.
Difficult question. I mean, we have this problem sometimes here where, honestly, I don't think we once asked at the time Gretchen Ritter, to whom do our casts actually belong? To the university as in its entirety, or just to the college? And nobody knew. And I think nobody wants to know because, and that's a point that you also brought up, Hannah. And some of the articles talk about these cast collections as white elephants. They are for any kind of administration, and you don't need to feel bad about it. And through the ages, they are a nuisance because they take so much space and they are difficult to transport, etc. But on the other side, you don't want to throw them out. They seem kind of important. And that, I mean, for us, it's absurd. If you go to the warehouse, all these fragments will never, ever will they be, put together again. I mean, I think the point is you can tell interesting stories. Now to the question, I think it's maybe not so much a question of to whom it belongs, but what you make of it, right? Here at Cornell, some individuals took plaster casts to their homes when they were sort of lying on the ground somewhere disposed of. And some of them are happy to give them back, others aren't, because they say exactly that. You threw them out, I'm not gonna give it back. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but I wish you good luck for your project in The Hague, and I hope you keep in touch and you tell me more about it. Yeah, Sophia.
Thank you. So wait.
Oh,
Sorry. I have a new microphone for the recording. Thank you so much. Is this loud enough?
yeah.
Thank you. So I was wondering, you mentioned that people regretted destroying the casts. If you could say more about why. Is it just because they seemed like bodies? Did they regret it in the moment of destruction or years later?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question because it also gives me a little bit of an occasion to talk more about. I mean, in the end, we were not able to always really figure out what was the target, and we felt that certainly Greco-Roman art was not the target, and often the casts were certainly also not the general target. Only maybe in this moment, I feel, of course, if a cast is destroyed, it's spectacular. It's pretty easy compared to marble, right? And if it cracks, I mean, I've seen it happen. It's satisfying for sure. No, I also say that there's a certain liberating aspect of it, right? I won't deny it. But it's often, and interesting also at Cornell, and this often relies on these kind of, more rumors here at Cornell. And then several of the colleagues at the conference would say tell the same stories. There's somebody having, I know who destroyed them, but I can't release the names, as if it had been a murder or something, right? And then in Ireland, their students then had destroyed the cast, but then released a letter that they did not want this to happen. Right. In the end, they must have felt either these are precious objects or real bodies. I don't know, but they kind of felt that this was too much. Right. It's really funny. There is and it's again, I don't know, this kind of white. The other thing with iconoclasm, especially in the context of the cast, of course, it's like totally futile. I mean, you can destroy this one cast, but there are thousands of others. You will never be able to erase this thing, right? So, right. And therefore, all the more interesting that they become so individualized, right?
It really strikes me as performative because I think since, the 1920s, 1930s, at least at Cornell, with the fact that the institution itself was putting the cafe into the cast collection, it sort of demoted, in a sense, the objects from being art. So it's almost just, it seems to me very much like an activist's performance, because it seems halfway, it's halfway there, right? It's not destroying something that is unique, quote unquote. So I think some of the thought processes, at least that I was seeing when I was doing some of the research, was a way to make a statement without perhaps getting expelled. It was almost, it's this way to make an impact without making a full impact, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Odd psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a psychiatrist. So I wonder what someone would say about that, but interesting to note in the history too.
I mean, I also found it interesting, Hannah, that you said this before. The students found they were precious because they were broken, right? This is certainly, it seems more ancient, right? I mean, I always have the impression when I teach classes now with Plaster Cast, and I feel kind of a little bit, I mean, I give the whole spiel of how problematic the casts are and what they did, etc. But the students often don't think that's an issue. And I think what they like about the casts is the fact to hear that they were once acquired for them, right? For students to be taught, even if now it doesn't make sense anymore. But in a way, that's a way to appropriate them, or make them their own to a certain extent, right? Even if we encourage them to be critical, etc., right? It has an emotional value. I mean, no question, right? Yeah.
I have one last question. This is from online from Peter Hurdle. The Chroma exhibit at the Met is shaking up how we think about classical sculpture. Would coloring all of the plaster casts at Cornell be an appropriate action?
That's a super interesting and very good question. Gives me also the occasion to go back to Munich. I basically grew up with this Chroma project. The exhibitors tried this out already when I was a grad student in Munich. I don't think that coloring the casts is a solution. On the one side, I mean, we thought about it and I've talked about it with the students a lot. We think maybe projecting colors onto them, or in a way, making it sort of more flexible thing. That would certainly make sense, but I would not want the plaster casts to appear in color, because when they were made, they were white and they were supposed to be white. And that's part of their also nefarious history. And I wouldn't want to erase that part of the history, right? This neoclassicist aesthetic. I mean, a lot of the reaction against, the classical past is a reaction against neoclassicism. And in particular, also interesting and deserves more investigation. I think that the reaction between, or the history between Europe and the United States is so different. In the United States, this neoclassicist aesthetics belongs to the foundation of this country. That's very different in Germany, where neoclassicism is not really an issue, right? And people would, so I think that, and again, this needs more investigation. But for that very reason, also, I don't think we should sort of gloss over that history, right? We should show. I mean, as I showed also with these experiments, that's a possibility. If we talk about the one side of the cast in which it represents the prototype, but we should keep it open that it has so many other layers, and it's much more complicated, right? So coloring them forever, so to speak, I don't think is a good solution. We should keep it flexible, right?
The Met's exhibit is a good potential topic for someone to investigate further, because some of those are not casts that they already had. They created new casts to then color. So that's also interesting, because they do still have some casts displayed as white casts alongside of the chromatic casts. So
No. That's it, right?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And
you so
we're
much.
out of time, so let's
Thank you, Hannah.
thank you.
So if you want to see the little made in China cast, they are super. Okay, open this over.